The Atlantic does not forgive. It takes stone and steel and reduces them to salt and rust. It hammers at foundations, seeps into mortar, corrodes iron, and waits. On a gray morning in November 1993, the waves broke against the seawall at Rough Point as they had for more than a century, indifferent to the woman who watched them from a window on the second floor. She was 80 years old, the richest woman in America, and she was alone in a house with 60 rooms, most of them empty, most of them cold. Doris Duke had inherited more money than she could ever spend, $400 million in 1925 when she was 12 years old. Her father, James Buchanan Duke, had built an empire on tobacco and hydroelectric power. He had created the American Tobacco Company, controlled nearly all cigarette production in the United States, then pivoted to utilities when antitrust laws forced him to divest. By the time he died, he owned so much that his wealth could not be accurately calculated. It existed as a force, not a number, and all of it passed to his only child. But money, as Doris would discover, does not simplify life. It complicates it. It creates obligations, attracts predators, isolates you from ordinary human contact, and it makes you responsible for things, objects, properties, legacies that are too large to maintain but too significant to abandon. Rough Point was one of those things. The mansion sits on the southern tip of Bellevue Avenue in Newport, Rhode Island, at the place where the land ends and the ocean begins. It was built in 1887 by Frederick William Vanderbilt, grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt, the shipping and railroad magnate who had accumulated one of the largest fortunes in American history. Frederick wanted a summer house, something relatively modest by Vanderbilt standards, something that would allow him and his wife to escape the heat of New York without the ostentation of the larger cottages that were rising along Bellevue Avenue. He commissioned the architectural firm of Peabody and Stearns, who designed a house in the English manor style, red sandstone quarried in Connecticut, steep gables, mullioned windows, a structure that suggested age and permanence even though it was new. The house contained 39 rooms, a great hall with a ceiling open to the second floor, a dining room that could seat 24, a library paneled in oak, guest suites with ocean views, servants' quarters on the third floor, a basement with kitchens, storage rooms, and the mechanical systems that made the house function. The estate occupied 10 acres on a rocky promontory that jutted into the Atlantic. The landscaping was deliberately restrained, lawns, hedges, a few specimen trees, so that nothing obstructed the view of the ocean. From the terraces on the south side of the house, you could see only water and sky. On clear days, the horizon was a perfect line. On stormy days, the waves rose high enough to send spray over the seawall. The Vanderbilts used Rough Point as a seasonal residence. They arrived in June and stayed through September. The house was opened by a staff of 20, maids, footmen, cooks, gardeners, a butler, a housekeeper. They cleaned every room, aired out linens, polished silver, and prepared the house for occupation. When the season ended, the staff closed the house again. They drained the pipes, covered the furniture, shuttered the windows, and departed. The house spent 9 months of every year empty and silent. This was the rhythm of life for the summer cottages of Newport. They were not homes, they were stages for a social season that lasted 12 weeks. During those weeks, the families who owned them competed to display their wealth, their taste, their connections. They hosted balls, dinners, garden parties. They were photographed, they were written about, and then they left. The houses remained, massive and vacant, maintained by skeleton crews who checked for leaks, monitored the furnaces, and ensured that nothing deteriorated too visibly.
Frederick Vanderbilt sold Rough Point in 1922. He and his wife were aging. They no longer had the energy for Newport society. The buyer was William Leeds, a tin magnate who had made a fortune supplying metal to the canning industry. Leeds wanted to establish his family among the Newport elite, and Rough Point was available. He paid a price that was not disclosed but was understood to be substantial. He moved in with his wife and son, and for a few years the house functioned as it had under the Vanderbilts. Then Leeds died, suddenly, of a heart attack. His widow remarried. His son inherited the house but did not want it. Rough Point sat empty for several years, a problem no one knew how to solve. It was too large to sell easily, too expensive to maintain without using it, too significant to demolish, and so it waited. In 1922, James Buchanan Duke bought Rough Point for his daughter. She was 10 years old. He wanted her to have a place in Newport, to be part of the society that mattered, to understand what it meant to occupy a position at the top of American wealth. He spent another fortune renovating the house, updating the plumbing and electrical systems, redecorating the interiors to suit his taste. He hired the best craftsmen available. He installed a pipe organ in the Great Hall. He filled the house with furniture, paintings, tapestries, porcelain. He made it perfect. And then, 3 years later, he died. Doris was 12. She inherited everything. The houses, there were several, in addition to Rough Point, the investments, the trusts, the companies, the responsibilities. Her mother, Nana Line, became the executor of the estate until Doris came of age. But Nana Line was not interested in business. She was interested in society, in maintaining the family's position, in ensuring that Doris married well and understood her obligations. Rough Point became a summer ritual. Every year the house was opened. Every year Doris and her mother arrived, along with a staff of 30. Every year they hosted parties, entertained guests, and performed the social duties expected of them. Doris hated it. She hated the performances, the expectations, the constant scrutiny. She hated the house, which was beautiful but cold, formal but empty. She felt more like a prisoner than an heiress. And she began to understand something that would shape the rest of her life. Money does not give you freedom. It gives you obligations that you cannot escape. When she turned 21 and gained control of her inheritance, Doris began to travel. She went to Europe, to Asia, to the Middle East. She studied languages, collected art, learned about architecture and design. She married badly. Her first husband, James Cromwell, was a politician and a fortune hunter. He spent her money freely and resented her independence. The marriage lasted less than a decade. She married again to a man named Porfirio Rubirosa, a Dominican diplomat and playboy who was even worse than Cromwell. That marriage lasted a year. But through it all, she kept Rough Point. She returned to Newport every summer, not because she wanted to, but because the house was hers, and she could not bring herself to abandon it. She hired staff, she maintained the property, she opened the house and closed it according to the old rhythms. And slowly, over decades, the house began to change her relationship with it. She stopped hosting large parties. She stopped performing for Newport society. She began to treat Rough Point not as a stage, but as a retreat. She brought her dogs, she loved dogs, especially the large breeds, and let them run freely through the rooms. She converted some of the formal spaces into galleries for her art collection. She spent hours in the library, reading, thinking, planning her next trip. The house became less a showpiece and more a sanctuary. But sanctuaries are expensive. Rough Point required constant maintenance. The roof leaked, the stone walls needed repointing,
The windows had to be replaced. Salt air corroded the frames and seals. The plumbing was old. The electrical system was outdated. The heating system consumed oil at a staggering rate. The landscaping required a full-time gardener. The interiors required maids, a housekeeper, a butler. The cost of operating the house, even when Doris was not in residence, was immense. And Doris, despite her wealth, was not careless with money. She had been raised by a mother who believed in economy, even extravagant economy. She reviewed household accounts. She questioned expenses. She fired staff who she believed were stealing or wasting resources. She could be generous, but she could also be severe. The staff who worked at Rough Point learned to be careful, to document everything, to avoid any appearance of impropriety. This created a strange atmosphere in the house. It was luxurious but tense, beautiful but joyless. The staff moved through the rooms silently, performing their duties with precision, always aware that they were being watched, always conscious that a mistake could cost them their position. They did not live in the house. By the 1960s, most of the servants' quarters had been repurposed, so they commuted from Newport, arriving early in the morning and leaving in the evening. They knew the house better than Doris did. They knew which rooms were never used, which systems were failing, which parts of the structure were vulnerable. The house was aging. That was the reality no one wanted to acknowledge. It had been built in 1887, and by 1970 it was over 80 years old. The materials were good, sandstone, oak, slate, but nothing lasts forever. The roof needed to be replaced entirely. The foundation had cracks where water was seeping in. The chimneys were crumbling. The wood in some of the window frames was rotting. The plaster in several rooms was falling away from the lath. These were not cosmetic problems. They were structural, and addressing them would require a level of investment that even Doris, with all her wealth, hesitated to make. Because the question was always, why? Why spend millions on a house that was used only a few months a year? Why preserve something that had no practical purpose? Why maintain a monument to a way of life that no longer existed? Doris did not have a good answer. She simply could not let it go. In 1966, something happened that changed her relationship with Rough Point forever. A man named Eduardo Tiarella, an interior designer who had been working with Doris on renovations to one of her other properties, was killed in an accident at the estate. He was standing near the front gate when Doris, driving her car, accelerated suddenly. The car struck him, crushed him against the gate, and killed him instantly. The police investigated. Doris claimed the accelerator had stuck. She was distraught, she said. She had not meant to accelerate. It was a mechanical failure. The police accepted her explanation. There was no evidence of foul play. No charges were filed. Eduardo Tiarella was buried, and the case was closed. But questions remained. People who knew Doris, who had worked with her, who understood her temper, wondered. She had fought with Tiarella the day before his death. He had wanted to leave her employment, to return to California, to pursue other projects. She had refused. She had been angry. And then, the next day, he was dead. No one accused her publicly, but the story circulated. It became part of the mythology of Rough Point, the house where the richest woman in America might have killed a man and gotten away with it. True or not, the story cast a shadow. The staff who worked at Rough Point became even more cautious. Doris became even more isolated. She stopped inviting people to the house. She stopped traveling as frequently. She spent more and more time alone with her dogs, in a house that was too large for one person. By the 1980s, Rough Point had become a burden. Doris was in her 70s. She was still wealthy, still powerful, but she was no longer young. The house required more maintenance than ever. The staff was aging too, and finding replacements was difficult. Young people did not want to work in domestic service. They wanted other careers, other opportunities. The few who applied for positions at Rough Point often quit after a few months, unable to tolerate the isolation, the demands, the strange mix of luxury and austerity that defined life in the house. Doris began to consider what would happen to Rough Point after her death. She had no children, no direct heirs. Her estate would pass to a foundation she had established, the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, which was intended to support the arts, environmental conservation, medical research, and the prevention of cruelty to children and animals. But what would happen to the house? Should it be sold, demolished, turned into a museum? She did not decide. She could not decide. And so the house remained in limbo, maintained at great expense, occupied by a single woman and her staff, waiting for a resolution that never came. The cost of maintaining Rough Point in the 1980s was approximately $2 million a year. This included salaries for the staff, repairs to the structure, utilities, landscaping, insurance, and property taxes. $2 million to keep a house open that was used, at most, 4 months out of the year. The rest of the time, it sat empty. The staff came in daily to clean, to check the systems, to ensure nothing was deteriorating. But the house was silent. The rooms were dark. The furniture was covered. It was a monument being preserved for no one. Doris spent her final years moving between her properties. She had a house in Beverly Hills, a penthouse in New York, a farm in New Jersey, and Rough Point. She did not stay long in any of them. She was restless, dissatisfied, unable to settle. She surrounded herself with advisors, lawyers, doctors, staff, but she trusted no one. She believed everyone wanted something from her, and she was probably right. In October of 1993, Doris Duke died at her home in Beverly Hills. She was 80 years old. The cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, though there were rumors of complications, of neglect, of isolation so severe that even her wealth could not protect her. Her estate was valued at approximately $1.2 billion, making her one of the wealthiest women in American history. The question of what to do with Rough Point was finally answered. The foundation decided to turn it into a museum. The house, with all its contents, would be preserved and open to the public. It would become a monument not just to Doris Duke, but to the Gilded Age, to the families who had built these houses, to the way of life they represented. But before it could open, the house had to be stabilized. Engineers were brought in to assess the structure. What they found was alarming. The foundation had significant cracks. The roof was in worse condition than anyone had realized. The electrical system was dangerous. The plumbing was failing. Several rooms had water damage. The estimated cost to bring the house up to code, to make it safe for public occupancy, was over $15 million. The foundation spent the money. They had no choice. Rough Point was now part of Doris Duke's legacy, and the foundation existed to honor that legacy. Contractors were hired, the roof was replaced, the foundation was repaired, the electrical and plumbing systems were updated. The rooms were restored to their appearance in the 1980s when Doris had last occupied the house. Her furniture, her art, her personal belongings were left in place exactly as she had arranged them. In 2000, Rough Point opened to the public as a museum. Visitors could tour the house, see how Doris Duke had lived, view her art collection, and learn about the history of the property. The museum was managed by the Newport Restoration Foundation, an organization Doris herself had founded decades earlier to preserve historic buildings in Newport. But the cost of operating the museum was staggering. The house required a full-time staff of curators, guides, maintenance workers, and security personnel. The utilities alone, heating, cooling, electricity, cost hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. The insurance was astronomical. The ongoing maintenance, repairs to the roof, the stonework, the interior finishes, never stopped. The museum operated at a loss every year, subsidized by the foundation. And attendance was modest. Rough Point was one of many historic houses in Newport. It competed for visitors with the Breakers, Marble House, Rosecliff, and a dozen other estates. It was less grand than some, less famous than others. It was significant primarily because of Doris Duke, and while she had been famous in life, she was not a figure who captured the popular imagination in death. She had been too private, too difficult, too strange.
The museum struggled. In 2018, the Newport Restoration Foundation announced that Rough Point would close to the public. The cost of operating the museum could no longer be justified. The house would be preserved, but it would not be open for tours. It would return to what it had been for much of its history, a monument maintained at great expense, seen by almost no one. The announcement was met with sadness, but not surprise. Everyone involved understood the economics. Historic preservation is not self-sustaining. Houses like Rough Point require subsidies. They require donors who believe in the value of preservation for its own sake, who are willing to support institutions that will never be profitable, that exist only to maintain a connection to the past. And in America, in the 21st century, there are fewer and fewer of those donors. We live in a culture of demolition and replacement. Old buildings are torn down to make way for new construction. Historic districts are rezoned. Preservation is seen as an impediment to progress, a luxury we cannot afford. The past is something to be studied, perhaps, but not maintained, not at the cost of millions of dollars a year. Rough Point still stands. The foundation continues to maintain it. The roof is repaired when it leaks. The grounds are kept. The systems are monitored. But the house is closed. The rooms are empty. The furniture sits under dust covers. The ocean continues to batter the seawall, indifferent to the history of the place, indifferent to the money that has been spent, indifferent to the question of whether any of this matters. To understand what Rough Point represents, you have to understand the world that created it. The house was built in 1887 at the height of what Mark Twain called the Gilded Age. This was a period of extraordinary wealth accumulation in America, concentrated in the hands of a few families: the Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, the Dukes. These families controlled entire industries. They built railroads, steel mills, oil refineries, tobacco companies. They accumulated wealth on a scale that had never been seen before, and they displayed that wealth in ways that were deliberate, ostentatious, and carefully calculated to establish their position at the top of American society. Newport, Rhode Island, became the summer capital of this new aristocracy. The families who owned the great fortunes bought land on Bellevue Avenue and built houses that were called cottages, but were really palaces. The Breakers, built by Cornelius Vanderbilt II, had 70 rooms. Rosecliff, built by William Kissam Vanderbilt, was modeled on the Petit Trianon at Versailles. Rosecliff, built by Teresa Fair Ulrichs, had a ballroom that could accommodate 200 guests. These houses were not built for comfort. They were built to impress, to intimidate, to demonstrate that the families who owned them had achieved a level of wealth and power that placed them beyond ordinary concerns. But they were also traps. Once built, these houses had to be maintained. They required enormous staffs. They consumed vast amounts of coal, oil, water, electricity. They needed constant repairs. Roofs leaked, walls cracked, pipes corroded. They were expensive to heat in winter and expensive to cool in summer. And they were only used for a few months a year. The rest of the time, they sat empty.
monuments to wealth that no longer served any practical purpose. The families who built these houses understood this. They knew the houses were burdens, but they could not stop building them, because to stop would be to admit that they could not afford to maintain their position. And in the Gilded Age, appearance was everything. You were wealthy because you appeared wealthy. You were powerful because you appeared powerful. If you stopped building, stopped entertaining, stopped displaying your wealth, you disappeared from society. You became irrelevant.
And so the houses kept getting larger, more elaborate, more expensive. And the families who owned them spent more and more of their fortunes just to keep up. This is what economists call a positional arms race. Each family had to spend more than the others to maintain their relative status. The spending itself became the measure of success, not the pleasure derived from the houses, not the utility, but the sheer scale of the expenditure. Rough Point was part of this system, but it was also slightly outside it. Frederick Vanderbilt built it as a retreat, not as a showpiece. It was large, but not as large as the other cottages. It was elegant, but not ostentatious. It sat at the edge of Newport society, both part of it and apart from it, and that ambiguity would define the house's entire history. When James Buchanan Duke bought Rough Point for his daughter, he was attempting to secure her position in that society. He had built his fortune in tobacco, an industry that was profitable but not entirely respectable. Cigarettes were associated with the lower classes, with immigrants, with moral laxity. Duke wanted his daughter to transcend that association, to be accepted by the old money families, to marry into a lineage that would erase the taint of her father's origins. But it did not work. Doris was accepted, but she was never fully embraced. She was too rich, too independent, too difficult. She did not play by the rules. She traveled without a chaperone. She divorced her husbands. She collected art that was considered exotic or inappropriate. She surrounded herself with people who were not from the right families. She was, in the language of the time, unsuitable. And Rough Point reflected that. The house was never the center of Newport society. It was always peripheral. Doris hosted parties, but they were smaller, stranger, less formal than the events at the other cottages. She invited artists, musicians, intellectuals, people who were interesting but not necessarily acceptable. She treated the house not as a stage, but as a home, which was almost transgressive. You were not supposed to live in these houses. You were supposed to perform in them. By the time Doris inherited full control of Rough Point in the 1940s, the world that had created the house was already disappearing. The Gilded Age was over. The Depression had destroyed many of the great fortunes. The families who remained wealthy had learned to be more discreet. Conspicuous consumption was no longer fashionable. It was seen as tasteless, even immoral. The cottages of Newport began to close. Some were sold. Some were demolished. Some were given to institutions, universities, preservation societies, who turned them into museums. Doris kept Rough Point, but she changed how she used it. She stopped trying to be part of Newport society. She stopped hosting the large, formal parties. She began to treat the house as a private retreat, a place where she could escape the demands of her public life. She brought her art collection to Rough Point and used the rooms as galleries. She converted the great hall into a space for her pipe organ, which she would play for hours, alone, filling the house with sound. But the house still required a staff, and that staff saw things that Doris did not want anyone to see. They saw her temper. They saw her paranoia. They saw the way she treated people, sometimes with great generosity, sometimes with cruelty. They saw the dogs, dozens of them at times, running through the house, damaging furniture, leaving messes that had to be cleaned. They saw the decline, both of the house and of the woman who owned it. One of the maids who worked at Rough Point in the 1970s later described the experience in an interview. She said the house was beautiful but oppressive.
The rooms were cold. The furniture was uncomfortable. You were not allowed to touch anything without permission. You were watched constantly, either by Doris herself or by the housekeeper, who reported everything back to her. Mistakes were not tolerated. If you broke something, even accidentally, you were fired. If you were suspected of stealing, even if there was no evidence, you were fired. The turnover was constant. People lasted months, sometimes only weeks. And yet, the maid said, there was also something tragic about the place. Doris was surrounded by beautiful things, but she seemed to take no pleasure in them. She was wealthy beyond measure, but she was alone. She did not have friends, not real friends. She had employees, advisors, hangers-on, but no one who cared about her as a person. And the house, with all its grandeur, only emphasized that isolation. It was too large for one person, too formal, too cold. It was a monument to a way of life that no longer existed, maintained by a woman who could not let it go. The death of Eduardo Tirella in 1966 marked a turning point. Whether the accelerator stuck, as Doris claimed, or whether she deliberately ran him down, as some suspected, the result was the same. The house became associated with tragedy, with darkness, with the idea that great wealth does not protect you from moral consequence. The staff became more afraid. The visitors became fewer. The house began to feel haunted, not by ghosts, but by the weight of what had happened there. Doris continued to return to Rough Point every summer, but her stays became shorter. She spent more time at her other properties, more time traveling, more time anywhere but Newport. And when she was at Rough Point, she rarely left the house. She did not walk on the grounds. She did not visit the other estates. She stayed inside with her dogs, surrounded by her art, playing her pipe organ, alone. The staff continued to maintain the house, but they did so with a sense of futility. They knew the house was deteriorating. They knew the systems were failing. They knew that sooner or later something would break that could not be fixed. And they knew that Doris would not spend the money to address the underlying problems. She would pay for temporary repairs, for patches, for workarounds, but she would not authorize a comprehensive renovation. It was too expensive, and for what? A house she barely used? A monument to a past she could not escape? In the 1980s, the cost of maintaining Rough Point exceeded the cost of operating some small museums. $2 million, as mentioned earlier, but that figure does not capture the full picture. It does not include the cost of Doris's staff, her personal secretary, her lawyers, her financial advisors who managed the property. It does not include the insurance premiums, which were astronomical because of the value of the art collection. It does not include the security costs, which increased every year as crime rates rose in Newport and the house became more isolated. And it was isolated. By the 1980s, most of the other cottages on Bellevue Avenue had been converted into museums or sold to institutions. The families who had owned them were gone. The summer season that had once defined Newport was a memory. The tourists who visited the museums came and went in buses. They did not stay. They did not spend money in the town. They took photographs and left. Newport had become a theme park of the Gilded Age, a place where you could see how the wealthy had lived, but not a place where wealth was created or sustained.
Rough Point was part of that theme park, but it was still privately owned. Doris allowed limited access to scholars, to researchers, to people who have a legitimate reason to see the house. But she did not open it to the general public. She did not want strangers walking through her rooms, touching her things, judging her. And so the house remained closed, visible from the road but inaccessible, a mystery to the people who drove past it. When Doris died in 1993, the staff at Rough Point did not know what would happen. They assumed the house would be sold, that the art would be auctioned, that the furniture would be dispersed, that the house itself would either be demolished or converted into condominiums. That was what usually happened to houses like this. They were too expensive to maintain as single-family residences. They had to be divided up, turned into something else,
or destroyed. But the foundation surprised everyone. They decided to preserve Rough Point exactly as Doris had left it, every piece of furniture in place, every painting on the wall, every book on the shelf. The house would become a time capsule, a record of how one woman, the richest woman in America, had lived at the end of the 20th century. This decision was controversial. Some board members argued that it was a waste of money, that the foundation should sell the art, sell the furniture, sell the house, and use the proceeds to fund the charitable work that Doris had wanted to support. Others argued that the house itself was part of that charitable work, that it had educational value, that it would help people understand the history of wealth in America, the costs of that wealth, the isolation it creates. The decision to preserve the house won, but barely, and it came with conditions. The house would be open to the public, but only for limited tours. The art collection would remain, but it would be insured at enormous expense. The foundation would commit to maintaining the property, but only if it could be done without jeopardizing the other work of the foundation. The restoration that followed was extensive. Engineers discovered that the house was in worse condition than anyone had realized. The roof had multiple leaks. The foundation had cracks that were allowing water to seep into the basement. The electrical system was not just outdated, but dangerous. Some of the wiring was original to the house, over a century old, wrapped in insulation that had become brittle and combustible. The plumbing was failing. Several of the bathrooms were unusable. The heating system was inefficient and unreliable. Fixing these problems required opening up walls, removing floors, accessing systems that had not been touched in decades. And every time the contractors opened something up, they found more problems. Rot in the framing, corrosion in the pipes, damage from pests, termites, carpenter ants, and mice. The house was being consumed from the inside. The contractors worked for 3 years. They replaced the roof entirely. They repaired the foundation, injecting epoxy into the cracks and installing drainage systems to keep water away from the structure. They rewired the entire house, replacing every circuit, every outlet, every switch. They updated the plumbing, replacing cast iron pipes with modern materials. They restored the plaster in rooms where it had fallen. They repainted, refinished floors, repaired windows. And through it all, they were careful to preserve the appearance of the house as Doris had left it. The new wiring was hidden behind walls. The new pipes were concealed in existing chases. The repairs to the plaster were done in a way that matched the original texture and color. The goal was to make the house safe and functional without making it look restored. It had to look lived in, even though no one would ever live there again. The cost of this work exceeded $15 million for a house that would generate at most a few $100,000 a year in admissions fees. The economics made no sense. But economics, the foundation argued, were not the point. The point was preservation. The point was maintaining a connection to the past, to a moment in history when wealth was concentrated in ways that shaped the entire society.
When Rough Point opened as a museum in 2000, the reviews were mixed. Some critics praised the decision to preserve the house as Doris had left it. They said it gave visitors a sense of how she had actually lived, not how she wanted to be remembered. The disorder, the eccentricity, the mix of priceless art and ordinary objects, all of it told a story that was more honest than the carefully curated displays at other historic houses. Other critics were less kind. They said the house was depressing, that it emphasized isolation and decline rather than achievement, that it made Doris Duke seem pathetic rather than powerful, that the tours were too long, too detailed, too focused on the minutiae of daily life rather than the larger historical context. But the visitors came, not in huge numbers, but steadily. They walked through the rooms, looked at the art,
listened to the guides explain who Doris Duke had been and what the house represented. And many of them left with a sense of unease. The house was beautiful, the art was impressive, but the whole experience felt sad. You could feel the loneliness in the rooms. You could sense the burden of maintaining such a place. You could understand, in a way that no book or documentary could convey, what it meant to be responsible for something you could not use and could not abandon. The museum operated for 18 years. During that time, the foundation spent millions more on maintenance. The roof was repaired again, the HVAC system was upgraded, the security system was replaced, the landscaping was maintained, the staff was paid, the insurance premiums were met. And every year, the foundation's board reviewed the numbers and asked the same question: is this sustainable? The answer was always no, but they kept it open anyway. Because once you commit to preservation, it is very difficult to stop. To close the museum would be to admit that the house was not worth saving, that the history it represented was not important enough, that the investment, financial, emotional, institutional, had been a mistake. In 2018, the foundation finally made the decision to close Rough Point to public tours. The announcement was carefully worded. The house would be preserved, the collection would be maintained, but the cost of operating as a public museum could no longer be justified. The resources required could be better used to preserve other historic properties, to support other projects that aligned with Doris Duke's intentions. The staff was reduced, the guides were let go, the visitor center was closed. The house returned to what it had been for most of its history, a private estate maintained at great expense, occupied by no one. The decision was met with criticism from preservationists who argued that closing Rough Point set a dangerous precedent. If a foundation with over $1 billion in assets could not afford to keep a historic house open, what hope was there for smaller institutions? What would happen to the other cottages in Newport, the other historic houses across America? Were they all destined to close, to become private again, to slip back into obscurity? The foundation did not have good answers to these questions. They pointed to the economic realities. They noted that Rough Point had never been profitable, that attendance had declined, that younger generations were less interested in house museums. They acknowledged that the decision was difficult, but they insisted it was necessary. And perhaps it was. Perhaps the age of the house museum is over. Perhaps we no longer have the patience or the reverence or the money to maintain these places. Perhaps they belong to a past that we have moved beyond, a way of life that no longer resonates, a set of values that we no longer share. Or perhaps we are losing something important. Perhaps these houses, for all their flaws, are records of who we were and how we got here. Perhaps they remind us that wealth is not abstract, that it has consequences, that it creates obligations. Perhaps they show us that even the richest people are mortal, that even the grandest houses decay, that nothing, no fortune, no family, no structure, lasts forever.
Rough Point still stands. The ocean still breaks against the seawall. The roof still protects the rooms inside. The art is still on the walls. The furniture is still in place. But the house is empty. No one walks through the great hall. No one sits in the library. No one looks out the windows at the endless Atlantic. The foundation continues to maintain it. Contractors are called when repairs are needed. The systems are monitored. The grounds are kept. But for what? For whom? The house exists in a state of suspension, neither alive nor abandoned, maintained out of obligation rather than purpose. And perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps Rough Point has always been in suspension, always waiting for something that never quite arrived, waiting for Doris to find happiness, waiting for the world to change, waiting for someone to decide what it means, what it represents, whether it matters. The house has no answers. It simply endures. And as long as the foundation exists, as long as the money holds out,
it will continue to endure, a monument to wealth, to isolation, to the impossible weight of the past. A reminder that some burdens cannot be escaped, no matter how much money you have, that some obligations cannot be fulfilled, no matter how hard you try. Rough Point is not a tragedy, it is something quieter than that. It is a question without an answer, a house without a home, a monument to a woman who had everything and nothing at all. If you found this story compelling, if you want to understand more about the hidden costs of American wealth, the architecture of isolation, the estates that shaped our history, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this, more houses that have secrets, more families that build monuments they could not sustain, more legacies that endure only because someone, somewhere, decided they were worth the cost. Leave a comment if there is a place you would like explored, a mansion, a family, an institution, somewhere beautiful that hides something difficult. Until then, remember that the past is not free. It costs money to maintain. It requires labor to preserve. And sometimes, despite everything, it slips away.